April 1945, a forest road between Flossenburg and the Czech border, Germany. Pinwoods line the narrow, unpaved track. Birds sing in the cold morning air. Then the lead jeep of an American armored column slows to a crawl. The driver taps the brakes. In the right-hand ditch lies a bundle of striped cloth. It is a man. He is dead. His ribs press hard against his thin skin. His eyes stare at the gray sky. 200 yards ahead, another body rests against a tree stump. Then 3 more appear in a small clearing. Soon there are dozens. The bodies stretch into the distance. They form a quiet line that follows the winding road through the trees. General George S. Patton will find this trail tomorrow. He will see the exact path of the horror. His reaction will shock the local townspeople. He will force them to look at the cost of their silence. What Patton found along an 11-mile road lined with 300 bodies in striped uniforms. It is April 1945. A narrow forest road winds through the dense pines between Flossenburg and the Czech border. Sunlight filters through the green canopy, hitting the muddy ruts left by military trucks. The air is cold, crisp, and completely silent, except for the low rumble of an approaching American vehicle. Then, the lead scout spots something in the ditch. It is a shape. A gray and white striped jacket over bones. 10 yards later, there are 3 more shapes. Soon, the shapes become dozens, stretching forward as far as the eye can see into the dark woods. A single, bloody line of discarded human beings marks the dirt path. General George S. Patton will discover this horrific trail tomorrow morning. His response will force an entire German town to look at what they claim they never saw. What Patton found along an 11-mile road lined with 300 bodies in striped uniforms, April 1945. A deep forest road between Flossenburg and the Czech border, Germany. Pines block out the morning sun, creating cold, heavy shadows across the dirt track. A single American military truck rolls slowly through the mud, its engine low and steady. Then the front wheels break. The driver cuts the ignition. The woods become completely silent. Down in the ditch beside the front tire lies a shape. It is a man in a filthy, thin, blue and gray striped uniform. His face is pressed into the frozen mud, his hands bony, his legs thin as birch branches. A dark red stain covers the back of his canvas cap. 10 yards further down the road, another striped shape lies half hidden in the wet ferns. Then another, then 3 more. The bodies stretch into the distance as far as the eye can see. General George S. Patton will make a decision here that the local town will never forget. He will turn this long road of slaughter into a physical mirror of justice for those who tried to hide their crimes in the deep woods. What Patton found along an 11-mile road lined with 300 bodies in striped uniforms, April 1945. A dense pine forest stands along a winding dirt road between Flossenburg and the Czech border in Germany. Tall trees block the pale spring sunlight, casting long shadows across the ditches. The quiet of the woods is broken by the low rumble of an advancing armored column. Tank treads crunch over stones, and scout jeeps lead the way through the damp mountain air. Then, the lead vehicle suddenly stops. A dark shape lies in the mud ahead. It is a human body. It is emaciated, wearing a thin jacket with blue and gray stripes. A few yards further, there are 3 more, then a dozen. The corpses stretch as far as the eye can see through the trees. They mark a grim trail of a forced evacuation march. General George Patton will soon discover the horror left behind on this forest road, and he will force those who ignored it to face the grisly reality. Captain Robert Vance, a 31-year-old officer from Chicago, serving with the Third Army, rode in the second jeep of the advancing column. When the vehicles ground to a halt, he climbed out and walked toward the front. He found the lead scouts clustered around the first group of bodies in the ditch. Vance looked down at the starved remains, then looked ahead at the winding forest trail. He saw more striped uniforms scattered along the edge of the woods as far as the road stretched. A local German policeman stood by the side of the track, leaning against a wooden fence post with his arms crossed. Vance walked over to the man and pointed down at the corpses. He asked the policeman, who was responsible for the dead prisoners on the road. The local official shrugged his shoulders and looked away toward the trees. He said he knew nothing about any prisoners or where they had come from. Vance pointed directly at a fresh body lying less than 10 yards from the policeman's post. He told the man that the tracks were fresh, and the blood in the mud had not even dried yet. The policeman shook his head and said that the local population had no involvement with military movements through the forest. He stated that the village across the hill was entirely peaceful and minded its own business. Vance stepped closer and asked how an entire town could ignore hundreds of starving people marching past their doorsteps. The policeman spat on the ground and said that the people in the striped suits were subhumans who did not concern Germany. He remarked that if the guards decided to clear the road of useless burdens, it was a matter of state security. He added that no one in the district would weep for criminals who could no longer walk. Vance realized the depth of the local complicity as he listened to the officials speak. He saw that the entire community had watched the atrocities occur without raising a finger to stop them. He told the policeman to remain where he was and signaled for his radio operator to come forward immediately. Vance called back to headquarters and described the 11 miles of bodies and the attitude of the local authorities. The report reached Patton within the hour, April 1945. A forest road between Flossenburg and the Czech border. Pine trees line the narrow dirt track, and a light morning mist hangs over the ditches. It looks like any peaceful European woodland, but the silence is broken by the low rumble of an American military convoy. Mud splatters from the tires of a lead jeep as it slows to a sudden crawl. In the ditch lies a single figure in a striped gray uniform, face down, perfectly still. 50 yards further, there are 3 more, huddled together under the brush, then 5 more, then dozens. The bodies are skeletal, skin stretched tight over ribs, stretching out along the road as far as the eye can see. A single officer gave the order to clear the camp and leave no witnesses alive. General George S. Patton will make sure the men who did this carry the weight of every single step. What Patton found along an 11-mile road lined with 300 bodies in striped uniforms, April 1945. A dirt road winds through a dense pine forest between Flossenburg and the Czech border. Sunlight filters through the canopy, catching patches of melting snow. An American Third Army mechanized column moves eastward at a crawl, the heavy rumble of diesel engines vibrating through the damp air. Then, the lead vehicle stops. In the drainage ditch to the right lies a single figure. It is an emaciated human body, clad in thin blue and gray striped canvas. A few yards ahead lie 3 more. Soon, the soldiers realize the bodies are everywhere, stretching out along both sides of the trail, as far as the eye can see. Many have a single black powder burn at the base of the skull. General George S. Patton will discover this horrific trail tomorrow, and his response will permanently alter the lives of everyone living in the valley. Michael Dominguez returned to Albuquerque after the war. He married his high school sweetheart and raised 3 children. He worked as a mechanic, fixing commercial trucks in a quiet garage. He never spoke about the forest road to his neighbors. He never explained why he always kept an extra wool blanket in the trunk of his car, or why he could not bear to see food left on a plate. He lived a quiet life, surrounded by the desert sun, until he passed away in 1993. Eric Hagen was captured by British troops near Hamburg in late May 1945. He was wearing the uniform of a regular army private, but his blood group tattoo betrayed him. He was transferred to American custody and stood trial at Nuremberg for the Flossenburg evacuation deaths. A military tribunal sentenced him to life in prison. He served 15 years before a review board released him. He returned to Nuremberg, lived in a small apartment, and died bitter and forgotten in 1974. General George S. Patton never mentioned the 11-mile road in his public press conferences. He kept the official photographic report locked in the bottom drawer of his field desk until the day he died. In a private letter to his wife Beatrice, written just 3 days after the encounter, he penned a single line that summarized everything he felt. He wrote that some men fight for territory and some fight for glory. But on that Tuesday in the German pines, his army fought simply to prove that civilization still existed. What Patton found along an 11-mile road lined with 300 bodies in striped uniforms, April 1945. A forest road between Flossenburg and the Czech border, Germany. Pine trees line the narrow dirt track. Birds sing in the cold spring air. Everything looks peaceful until the lead American Jeep slows down. There is a heap of fabric in the ditch. It is blue and white striped cloth. Underneath the cloth is a man. He is skeletal, frozen, and dead. A single bullet hole punctures the back of his skull. A few yards ahead, there are 3 more bodies, then a dozen. The corpses stretch down the road as far as the eye can see. Over 300 people lie rotting in the mud, marking a horrific trail of cruelty. General George S. Patton will soon discover this nightmare, and his response will force an entire German town to face the horrific reality they tried to ignore. Some historians argue that Patton used these public confrontations as political theater to secure his own legacy or to intentionally humiliate the defeated German population. They believe his harsh methods bordered on psychological warfare and strayed far from standard military protocol. Others argue that his actions were entirely necessary, providing a swift, undeniable reality check to citizens who claimed ignorance of the industrial slaughter happening in their own backyards. They believe his absolute refusal to tolerate excuses forced an early, crucial acknowledgement of war crimes. What is certain is that the extensive film, photographic evidence, and official documentation gathered along that 11-mile road became foundation stones for the prosecutors at Nuremberg, ensuring the truth of the death marches could never be erased or denied by future generations. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the cleanup to standard military procedures? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth buried under the rubble of retreat, make sure to subscribe.